Hello and welcome. This video will be part 1 of my coverage of Sigmund Freud and psychoanalysis for PSY 230 personality theory. Freud is probably a name, Sigmund Freud is probably a name that you have heard before in many, many different contexts. Freud is probably the most well-known psychologist, let alone personality theorist in the world. As your authors describe it, you really can't escape the impacts that Freud has had on Western thought. Freudian ideas were not his alone. He was not the only person thinking the things he was thinking. He's just the most well-known among those who were thinking about human beings and human nature in the particular way that he did. He was also he had a flair for the flamboyant. He was very productive, and he became, in some circles, notorious for being someone who was breaking boundaries and pushing limits, especially in the context of Victorian Europe. But he was also very prolific. He wrote a lot, he spoke a lot, he traveled, and as a result was fairly influential. His ideas have, really kind of stuck in terms of their impact in popular culture. And even if you hadn't had a psychology course in the past, you would have heard the name Sigmund Freud. Just a little bit of history on Freud and where he came from, and when he lived and when he worked. As I mentioned in the introductory lectures, it's important that you position each of our theorists and theories in a place and time, because the ideas, the assumptions, the beliefs, the values of that particular place and time, as well as the personal experiences of the individuals involved, has a great deal to do with the ideas they eventually put out. So Sigmund Freud was born in Moravia in the mid-1800s. He died in London in 1939. He spent a good chunk of his childhood in Vienna, which is where he moved when he was 4. His family was Jewish, and even though he wasn't particularly observant and had fairly negative attitudes towards religion in general, being a Jew was significant because during his lifetime he was forced to leave Vienna as a result of the rise of the Nazis and the imminent threat of the Holocaust. He did study medicine and then spent several years as faculty of medicine in Vienna in the 1870s. He was quite young, and he earned, as your text states, he earned his medical degree at 26. So to rise to that level and to be teaching in the faculty of medicine shows that he was respected and he was quite good at what he did. That said, when we take this position, it's 2022, and we're looking back on Freud's life, there were some things he did that, from our modern standards, were like, he did what? There was a period of time when he was actively studying the effects of cocaine, and that included his own use of cocaine. Now, there's a bit of an urban legend that Freud was a complete and total cokehead. That doesn't appear to fit the facts of his actual life. He was interested, as were many other physicians in his sphere, working in Vienna and other parts of Western Europe at that time. He was interested in the stimulant capacity of cocaine, and he also thought that it might have some ability to open consciousness, so not only to improve productivity, but to break down people's barriers to conscious awareness of various thoughts. He did cease studying cocaine, though, when it became evident that taking cocaine on a regular basis was indeed a problem. He later, again, this was hypnosis was something that in his circle of people became interesting as a possible way into consciousness and subconsciousness, or as a way to change behavior. People like Charcot and Breuer. Breuer was his mentor, and who actually gets less credit than he deserves for many concepts and ideas that Freud eventually championed. Both were studying hypnosis as a way of understanding psychological phenomenon, but especially to change behaviors. He eventually abandoned the study of hypnosis, finding it too unpredictable and basically not particularly effective. In the late 1800s, from 1896 until he passed away, which is a significant period of time, that was when he was his most productive in terms of articulating and writing about and speaking about what he called psychoanalytic theory. And during that period of time was when he really honed his skills as a what we call now a psychiatrist, doing therapy practice with people. He tended to write a lot of case studies, but he also wrote a lot of theoretical books and papers, and he continued to be quite productive even when he was ill. He was, as I mentioned earlier, he was forced to flee to England. That was not a choice. But many people in his position, someone who was educated, someone with a higher degree, and the fact that he was Jewish, he knew that he would be targeted. And when the Germans overtook Austria during that period in 1938, he chose to take his family and flee. So that's how he ended up in London, England, where he passed away. He died of throat and mouth cancer, and it was a difficult death. If you look at Freud with a long lens, he remains controversial, and you'll see some obvious reasons for why he's controversial. But you can't really throw out Freud. Some students have asked me over the years, if he's so controversial and some of his ideas were so out there and so wrong, why do we continue talking about him? Why not just get rid of him? Well, part of the problem is Freudian ideas, even if you don't know that they're Freud's ideas, are woven into the fabric of Western culture. As you read this chapter, if this is your first exposure to Freud, you will recognize many of these concepts as things that you use in your everyday speech. So I want you to really pay attention to that as we work our way through his ideas. To look at the impact, I have inserted a bunch of pop culture images in here. Freud's impact was, in relative terms, pretty immediate and pretty strong. He proposed, and this is in part the reason why, he was really shifting the way thinkers in Western culture were imagining this thing called mental life, how we think and how we feel. He was really going at it from a different point of view and proposing an alternative set of ways of thinking about human behavior that went beyond a strictly biological approach, but also proposing some ideas like subconscious influence that were not something that people were talking about at the time. He gave us a much more compelling, for the time frame, way to define the difference between normal and abnormal, and even though many of those ideas have been seen as controversial and problematic, he was, in many ways, because at the time he was writing, there wasn't really a field called psychiatry. There wasn't really a functioning, organized career path called clinical psychology or counseling psychology. Freud by conceptualizing normal versus abnormal behavior and then proposing a therapeutic method for helping people to function better, he was really kind of paving the way for the development of those disciplines. His impact was also in the form of, in many ways, reflecting the kind of horrors that were present in his lifetime. You know, he experienced as a young person World War I. He experienced as an adult and into his old age the ramifications of World War II. He was not someone who was going to sit back and say human beings are nice and kind and all wonderfully designed to grow and be nice. He saw far too deeply the hostility, the violence, the ugliness of human beings and what they can do to each other. In many ways, his theory is based in, or at least shaped by, that experience of the European reality of World War I, World War II. He also was impactful in that he pushed us to really break down some of the limitations of what your authors call Victorian philosophy. There was this very, very rigid kind of cultural viewpoint that was pushed in the upper classes in Western Europe that kind of limited the way in which human beings were expected to behave in fairly restrictive ways. So Freud's ideas, especially his unabashed emphasis on sex and aggression as important forces in human psychology, really pushed the boundaries of the expectations, the cultural and social expectations of that upper-class Victorian cultural set. As I mentioned before, his impact can't be denied in that he, even though some of his techniques have been debunked and let go of, the fact that he believed that by talking to people, by helping them to come to terms with their subconscious content, that they could be made more functional, made more healthy in the way they go about their lives. He also believed that people need to work through trauma. And in some ways, he was ahead of his time with respect to trauma and its role in psychological growth and development. Psychoanalytic theory has never gone away. Clearly, his ideas, as I've said before, are interwoven into Western culture, which the United States is a part of that atmosphere. But even beyond that, in personality theorizing, in clinical and counseling psychology, psychoanalytic theory continues to have an influence, and there are still practitioners of modified forms of psychoanalytic practice. Now we're going to move on to talking about some of the foundational beliefs that Freud used in order to build his theory. One of these foundational ideas is the idea of psychic determinism, which sounds fancier than it really is. Basically, he believed that the physical body, that the mind, the brain, is a part of that physical body, and he described the body as being the place where your conscious energy, your mental energy, the force, the motivation for living, that's where it comes from. So your physicality is very important, and the fact that we are, he didn't espouse a separation between mind and body. The body houses that mental experience. So the body is the source of energy. He assumed that all thinking, all cognitions, all emotions, all behaviors, they can be interpreted. So he didn't believe that there was any sort of random behavior or random thought or random emotion. They all have meaning, and they're all connected somehow to that deep bodily source of energy. He argued that there is no random action. Our behaviors are all determined. Our feelings are determined. Our cognitions are determined. So there's nothing that can't be explained in what we do. To pull all those threads together, when your authors talk about mental events, they're largely referring to thinking, but also to the experience of emotion, and our awareness of our own behaviors. But basically, mental events come from intentions that are we're either aware of them or we're not aware of them. It doesn't matter. They come from these intentions that are determined by things that have happened in the past. So in one way, Freud is very past focused. He believed that anything that you're doing right now, anything you're feeling right now, anything you're thinking right now is shaped by, determined by what you've experienced in the past. So for example, if you're having lunch with a friend and you're finding yourself to feel uncomfortable with something your friend is saying, Freud would argue that the source of your discomfort, the reason why you're feeling that discomfort, isn't really anything your friend is doing or saying. It has far more to do with things that you have experienced in the past that are now being echoed by your current event, by the current experience that you're having. So if you have to interpret your discomfort in that moment, you have to go back into the past and find what kind of experience, what kind of, if it's discomfort you're feeling, it's likely for Freud to be some sort of trauma. So what trauma is now being echoed in this current emotional event? So he was very past oriented in saying that anything that is present is a combination of past experiences plus the body being the source of all mental energy. Freud, in his earliest kind of articulation of the way personality is structured, identified these different levels of consciousness. And you are likely familiar, at least on a surface level, with words like id ego and superego, with the word repress or repressed or repression. Freud believed that there were levels of consciousness where there's pre-conscious, there's consciousness, and there's unconscious. So the conscious experience is you being awake and aware of your current thinking, aware of your current behavior, aware of your current emotions, the condition of your body, and so on. The pre-conscious is that, just below the level of fully aware, but easily gotten to. So, right at the moment, I'm here looking at my screen, I'm talking. If I heard a sound or smelled a smell or caught a sight, I could shift into awareness of something different very quickly. Like someone just walked by the window in the room where I am seated. So right away I'm like, oh, there are people outside. That knowledge of outside was formerly pre-conscious and is now conscious. Or another kind of example, if I'm having a conversation with somebody, I'm consciously aware of the table, of the chairs, of the other person, what they look like. Oh, that's conscious. If that person asks me a question, say about my last birthday, that information could be quickly brought into the pre-conscious level and then quickly brought out into actual consciousness in the form of memory. The unconscious is relatively less accessible. So let's review these. Consciousness is the part of mind of which we're aware of it in any given moment. So right now, you're hearing my voice, you're maybe looking at a screen. You might be doing other things while you're doing that. At least that's what I do. But you're conscious. Preconscious is just on that surface underneath where you can easily access memories, ideas, if there's some sort of stimulus from the outside that gives you a reason. So it could be a trigger, it could be someone asking you a question, whatever. Then there's the unconscious. For Freud, he was this interesting mixture. Remember, he was medically trained. Granted, it was medicine in the late 1800s. But regardless, he had a very biology kind of background. He was thinking about the body. And he really didn't think we were any different from any other animal species. So he felt that the unconscious was this place where you found instinct. You found very animal elements to our biological nature. He believed that humans evolved the capacity to suppress those unconscious instincts and push them into the unconscious where we have less access to them so that we can control them. So he believed that in order for human beings to live together with other people and not kill each other, they had to suppress these instinctive elements that are dangerous to our ability to live together. So they get pushed into the unconscious. That doesn't mean they stop having an impact, though. Anything that's in the unconscious can leak to the surface. Freud had this idea that like your unconscious is like a pot of boiling water with a lid on it on your stove. And if that pot starts to boil over, the lid bounces and water can spill out. He felt the unconscious was basically the same way. Events out in the world, things that you're experiencing, if they trigger something in your preconscious but you can't quite put your finger on it, that may be the unconscious kind of poking you and saying, this connects to something in the past that you've repressed and that you're pushing to the surface. You may not be able to get it quickly. It may come out in the form of unexpected behaviors or problematic symptoms, for example. Now, also on this picture that I've included on the presentation, you can kind of see the connection between what we're going to talk about in a little bit, which is the structural elements that are connected to the unconscious, the conscious level, and the preconscious. The id is that repository of instinct. Ego is the self that is aware of the world. The superego is this internalized values system that is an inner critic. So before we look at those structures, we need to talk about impulses and how Freud used the concept impulse. Impulses, we could also call them drives, psychological drives or motivational drives. Freud kind of described them as pressure, energy that drives behavior. So you think about a time when you were really motivated to get something done, whatever it was, doesn't matter what, you really wanted to get it done. There's an impulse, there's a drive, there's a motive that pushes your behavior to do that thing. You could couch this in terms of the idea of a need. For Freud, impulses could sometimes be physical needs, like the need to have sex, the need to eat, the need to drink water. So sometimes he talked about them as physical impulses. They can also be purely psychical or psychological, and that was how he uses the concept of wishes. Sometimes our wishes are fantastical, sometimes they're logical, but we do have a tendency as a human species to imagine what we might want to have and to wish for it. Sometimes wishing a particular relationship or wishing someone would vanish, things like that. In your text, your authors summarize, and I'm going to go over this very quickly because you can read about it on your own. Impulses have 4 basic attributes to them in the Freudian model. They have to come from somewhere. So an impulse has to arise and for Freud, he often talked about impulses arising from instinct, and that tends to be in his theory the starting point. All impulses have some sort of aim, and they tend to create. So you have an impulse, and you want to do something, you feel motivated to do it, and you know what the finish point is, and that pressure, it becomes uncomfortable until you get the goal achieved. So there's an aim. Let's say you for Freud, he was always on about sex, so you're feeling sexually driven, the source comes from your biological need for sex. What's your aim? Have sex. So you're going to feel uncomfortable until you've released that need. There's also an impetus, which means there's a certain amount of energy that you have to put out in order to satisfy the need, and finally there's some object of the impulse. So if we go back to sexual desire, if the source is your need for sex, the aim is have sex now. The impetus is what Freud would call libido, which is libidinal energy or sexual energy, is driving it. The object might be your sexual partner. So how the role of impulses in the Freudian theory and the Freudian model, Freud assumed that healthy patterns are able to reduce tension associated with the need to satisfy impulses, to bring them back to a healthy level. So, healthy patterns, think about sexuality again. For Freud, he was living in Victorian Europe. Sexuality was tightly monitored. At the same time, these sexual restrictions, this prudery that Freud saw all around him, he knew very well that people were having lots of sex and they were not always doing it in an appropriate way. So, in his theory, he was arguing that people have to kind of navigate this space where their culture is very sexually repressed, but they still have basic biological needs that need to be satisfied. So what you have there is tension. You have your own sex drive and the need to satisfy it, but your culture says you aren't supposed to even think about sex very much. And you do it in a certain way with certain people and not in other ways with other people. So that's tension. So for healthy people, they have to find a way to get their needs met, but do so in a socially acceptable manner. So that's what we mean by a healthy pattern. The way your authors describe it, you have this cycle of behavior, and it runs a dimension. You can be fully relaxed and at ease, or you can be filled with tension, and that tension is often labeled by people as anxiety or unease or dissatisfaction. That dissatisfaction, anxiety, unease stimulates activity, and then once the need is satisfied or the impulse is satisfied, then the person goes back to being in a relaxed state and not motivated state. So this is referred to by personality theorists as a tension reduction approach, a tension reduction theory or model. So basically, Freud believes every behavior that you exhibit is somehow going to be, you can tie it back to you're doing something to reduce a tension associated with an impulse that comes from your unconscious. You don't like tension, tension doesn't feel good, so you do what needs to be done to reduce the tension associated with the impulse, and that returns you back to a stasis point of relaxation. The impulses that Freud talked about the most were libido, which is, it depends on what you're reading in Freudian theory. Sometimes he talked about it in straightforward terms about sexual energy. In other parts of his writing, he talked about libido more broadly, and in some cases in very life-affirming ways. And then there's the aggressive impulse. Libido, the broadest definition of libido is energy that is connected to what Freud called life impulses. So sex, reproduction, and in some of his writing, an ill-defined kind of growth motive. But generally speaking, he focused his attention on sex and reproduction as being connected to libido, but also had a way of talking about it more generally as associated with just vivid life. Aggressive energies, there were places in Freudian theory where he connects this to sort of wanton destructiveness, where he believed that inside each of us, in addition to libidinal energy, which is life-driven, there's also destructive, self-destructive, and other destructive impulses as well. He felt that people were capable of both wonderful, loving, productive behaviors, but simultaneously they were capable of the darkest and most horrible of things. And we are constantly caught between the two. These are inconsistent, incompatible impulses. They sometimes intersect, they sometimes get tangled up with one another in what Freud would describe as pathological ways. So, for example, if you had a person who, in Freud's time, and he had a case study like this, a patient who could only experience sexual satisfaction when being struck violently. His interpretation of that was that this person's libido and aggressive energy drives had become problematically intertwined, and the guilt and anxiety associated with the death impulse was twisting the healthy expression of sexuality in his early 1900s reality of it. Cathexis is a concept, we don't spend a whole lot of time on this in this chapter, but cathexis is the process by which your consciousness can tap into what Freud called libidinal energy and then kind of place it on a person or a thing or an idea. So, a person could become intensely attached to the idea of having a relationship with a specific person. So let's say, he has a patient who comes in and has an obsession with a person at their workplace, and they wish to have some kind of relationship, but the person is unavailable. Cathexis has occurred in that case where the person has this libidinal unsatisfied energy that's pushing them, it's making them uncomfortable, and they've cathected that energy, that drive, onto that target person, and they're uncomfortable because they can't satisfy that need. They can't use that libidinal energy with that target. Another example, a person could take all of their available libidinal energy and throw it into work, kind of displacing it. And when you do that, you're not directly satisfying the needs that are associated with it, but instead kind of cathecting the energy in this case, a more productive direction. Your authors use this phrase, cathected libido is no longer mobile. Once libidinal energy has been attached to a target, whether it's becoming obsessive about a potential partner or turning all of your energies into your work, the energy is kind of in a way bound to that pursuit. It's kind of tethered to that pursuit. The word I would use for this is obsession. It's, when we talk about people being workaholics or being obsessed with another person, that's it's really similar in many, many ways to what Freud was referring to as cathected libido. Freud often talked about how when he is attempting to help people, when he is treating them for problems that they're having, it's often because of the anxiety and guilt associated with libido that's been cathected in an inappropriate direction. He argued that was often a source of neurosis. So, he had case studies in which people became, inappropriately obsessed with a person with whom they could not have a physical sexual relationship. Maybe it was inappropriate social target, maybe inappropriate by age or sex, whatever. It was inappropriately cathected, and it was making people sad. He argued that inappropriately cathected libido means that the drive or the impulse is not being, it's being partially satisfied. It's not being satisfied in a direct enough way to help people go back to that naturally relaxed state. So in therapy, the idea would be to disconnect the libido from that cathected object and then redirect it into a more healthy direction. And that ends part 1 of my coverage of Freud.